Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, how the US kept Europe's armies small on purpose. Hey guys, my name's Connor if you're new. Hope everyone's doing well. Preemptive like you made simple. Um Cold War era tactic to fight Soviet influence? Maybe. I don't know. Let's find out. I'm sure to make it so that the US has more power overall, since if Europe needs them militarily, then Europe can do less on its own without US approval. So that's my best guess.
I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic.
Pete Hegseth. Oh, he's drunk again.
Pete Hegseth called Europe in a now leaked message to Trump's top
I'm not
team.
one to talk.
And he's not alone. Vice President J.D. Vance, who's never been Europe's biggest fan, chimed in. I hate the idea of bailing out Europe again. And their boss? Well, here's President Trump himself.
Yeah, I think they've been freeloading. The European Union's been absolutely terrible to us on trade, terrible. And as you know, NATO, I got them to pay hundreds of billions of dollars. They were way behind.
But let's be clear, this isn't just a Republican thing. Even President Obama once called out Europe for not pulling its weight on military spending. So, are they right? Is Europe really freeloading of American power? Well, the short answer is yes, but it comes with a massive caveat. It's by design. Not European design, but US design. But before
Okay, so okay, I guess we need to go further into it. Is it a Cold War relic that the US now wants to stop doing it? But in the beginning, it was the US's fault in the first place by not promoting more European self-defense?
Before we break that controversial statement down, let's look at the numbers first. The US is a military behemoth. In
Almost
2024,
$1 trillion.
the United States alone covered nearly half of NATO's total defense budget. That's about $968 billion. Let me repeat that. One country, the USA, pays more than all the other NATO countries combined. Even though most NATO members ramped up spending following the invasion of Ukraine, the gap still remains huge. Back in 2021, before the war in Ukraine, this gap was even larger, with the US accounting for around 70% of NATO spending. Meanwhile, back then most European countries were falling short of NATO's 2% of GDP spending target. And then there's boots on the ground. Around 100,000 US troops are stationed across Europe, mostly in Germany, but also in Italy, the UK, Poland, and Spain. And these aren't just symbolic. In a crisis, they're the front line, and they'd be backed up by another 200,000 troops ready to fight in a moment's notice. Many of them armored divisions designed specifically for Eastern Europe. Oh, and let's not forget about the nuclear bombs. Experts estimate that the US has about 100 tactical nuclear bombs stored across Europe, in Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, in Italy, and Turkey. So yeah, based on the numbers, it really does look like Europe is getting a free ride, while the US is doing all the heavy lifting. But it's very easy to paint Europe as lazy and cheap. And here's our argument. This setup isn't just tolerated by the US, it's engineered by it. Think about it. If Europe had a fully autonomous military, it could act independently. That could mean acting without American approval. And that is something Washington hasn't been a fan of in the past.
Yeah, there's a give and take. So do you want to spend more of your tax money on military and be less dependent on the USA? And the USA, do you want to spend more money? Like, you can't have it both ways. Do you want to spend more money and have countries more reliant on you and try and downplay them spending money and then have more power? Or do you want less overall power but less spending? You know, like, you can't complain that people aren't spending enough and also expect to keep the same amount of power and I can't think of other words. Say same amount of initiative. My brain is slow. There's like that policeman of the world mentality that I think a lot of previous American administrations had. And I think that the USA shouldn't be that sort of policeman of the world, because I don't think any country is trustworthy enough to really have that power, nor should they really have to. And so I think other countries should start being more independent from the USA, and the USA should realize that that'll come with a little less global pull weight. Man, that was horribly said. I hope somehow my opinion got across there.
A fully autonomous military, it could act independently. That could mean acting without American approval, and that is something Washington hasn't been a fan of in the past. Let's look at some of our history. After World War II, America didn't just rebuild Europe's economies, it locked in its role as military protector. And when Europe tried to flex its muscles independently, America kind of shut it down. One prime example is the 1956 Suez Crisis. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel invaded. But instead of backing its allies, the US joined the Soviet Union, enforcing them to back down. The result? A humiliated UK and a very clear message. You don't act without Uncle Sam. Then there's France, though.
That sounds so nefarious. Oh, gotta love French, the French attitude. I've always admired it. But that's like it's like seeing your buddies. Wait, what's a good? It's like, see, that didn't work out, did it? See, now just let me control everything. You know, there's something a little messed up by that. It's like, okay, we are making our own international decisions, and then America's like, okay, try and go do it, and then he's sides with his greatest enemy just to make his allies look bad and make them more reliant on the US, or at least perceived that way.
Very clear message. You don't act without Uncle Sam. Then there's France, though. Under President Charles de Gaulle, France tried to break away from the US, and he somewhat succeeded. In 1966,
it's like, sorry. It's like, oh, I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna do this myself. I don't need all of your help. And it's like, okay, good luck, pal. And then going and setting up a bunch of obstacles, and then say, I gotta stop, sorry.
France withdrew away from the US, and he somewhat succeeded. In 1966, France withdrew from NATO's integrated military command and even expelled US military bases and troops from French territory. Did it last? It did, for a while. But in 2009, France came back into the fold. Today it's the only Western European power without a permanent American base. But even France remains tightly integrated with US-led NATO structures. After the Cold War, the European Union wasn't just about trade anymore. It started talking defense. In 1998, at the St. Malo summit, the UK and France agreed. Europe needs military capability independent of the US. Washington, obviously, was not thrilled. US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright laid down the 3Ds. No duplication of NATO, no discrimination against non-EU NATO members, and most importantly, no decoupling from the US.
Why, though? Okay, so all of these just seem like the same thing. No duplication so that the US can't be involved in a non-NATO duplicate military alliance. No discrimination against non-EU NATO members like the USA, and no decoupling from the USA. So it just seems like these are all just no decoupling from the USA. And my main theory, my mind goes to, is that, well, if they're more decoupled from the USA, then a lot of the USA's agenda around the world is going to be less certain because it can't threaten or rely on other countries as much in forming some sort of coalition, whether it be in some war or some what are you called? Sanction idea against some country. And so it's just protecting American power, since, okay.
But Europe pressed ahead anyway. In 1999, the EU launched the European Security and Defense Policy and set a very ambitious goal to build a 60,000-strong rapid deployment force, ready to act within 60 days and sustain operations for up to a year. The American pushback, though, was immediate and fierce. By 2000, the US Defense Secretary William Cohen warned that there would be no EU caucus within NATO, and went as far as suggesting that if the EU moved forward with its plans, NATO could become a relic of the past. The message was...
And this is pre-9/11, which makes this even a little more strange to me, because the first Gulf War in the early 90s, okay, 2 years before I was born, was a pretty big success, right? And very quick and everything. And so I'd imagine with post 9/11 stuff, the USA might want to act more in this way, because now you're a lot more foreign entanglements, and having less reliance on you will mean less ability for you to coerce other allies into helping you.
With its plans, NATO could become a relic of the past. The message was super clear. The US wasn't just skeptical of EU defense and autonomy, it feared it. A strong, independent European military could reduce NATO's relevance, and by extension, diminish America's influence in Europe. And in a world where the US faced no serious rivals, even the possibility of a rising European challenger was treated like a national security threat. However, caught between American pressure and internal divisions...
Okay, but the problem is that the hypocrisy there is that, well, by that logic, you already are a giant national security threat to Europe. And so why is it that you get to worry about even the smallest little national security threat, where you doing this is a giant national security threat to Europe? And so if I'm Europe, I'm like, what? You're afraid of losing a little power when you getting this is making us already have a giant deficit of power?
Which is super typical in Europe. However, caught between American pressure and internal divisions, which is super typical in Europe, the EU's vision for its own rapid reaction force quietly fizzled out. So, let's recap. Europe can't act alone. Check. Europe can't build its own defense structure. Check. What's next? Well, what about making sure European armies can't fight independently? Enter the next phase, military specialization. NATO, led by the US, has encouraged member states, everyone except America of course, to specialize their forces. That means instead of every country having a full self-sufficient...
That's diabolical. If that is awful, if that's the reason. So you don't want any country to have an overall military capability in all areas. You want to make them specialize so that they can't fight a war unless they get other countries with them. That is
military. They each focus on just a few roles. Now on paper, that sounds practical. Budget cuts, efficiency, interoperability. But here's the thing. When you specialize your military, you lose the ability to act alone. You become reliant on allies to fill in the gaps. And ultimately, that means relying on the United States. The US provides critical military enablers, the behind-the-scenes capabilities that makes modern warfare possible. These include aerial refueling tankers, without which European jets have very limited range. Strategic airlift, the giant C-17 and C-5 aircraft that can move troops and heavy equipment across continents in hours. And satellite renaissance and GPS, mostly controlled by the US military. And of course, there's much, much more. Without these enablers, even well-trained European armies are blind, slow, and limited in reach. Now, let's look back at the timeline. NATO specialization really took shape starting in 2002, with the Prague summit marking the first major push. Things accelerated further with the Smart Defense Initiative in 2011. And that brings us to our third lesson. Europe developing away from a self-sufficient military, partly thanks to US influence. A very convenient outcome if you're trying to stay in control. Now, up to this point, we focus how the US has blocked Europe from becoming militarily independent. But then, why do US presidents keep demanding Europe spends more? Obama pushed for a minimum of 2% of GDP, and Trump went further, suggesting even 5% of GDP. Doesn't that mean the US actually wants a stronger Europe?
Well, if you keep them separate, if you again don't get the all-around army in each European country, or at least in some European countries, then even if you spend more, but you're still specialized, you still can't fight a war on your own. So,
well, we think not necessarily. You see, it might all be about profit. Not for Europe, but the US. Let's talk numbers. This bar chart shows how much a selected group of European NATO countries has spent on US military equipment.
France, man. France is the only one that gets it. Not anymore, but they did it from the start.
Over the past 4 years, the Netherlands tops the list with a staggering 97% of its purchases coming from the US, while France lags behind at just 6%. On average, European NATO countries source 64% of their military gear from the US. That's billions flowing straight to American defense giants like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing. Now imagine if every European country doubled its defense budget, as some are doing now. That's not just rearmament. That's a massive windfall for the US defense industry.
Okay, what I'm getting is that there's a giant difference between spending more money, between asking Europeans to spend more money and asking Europeans to become more self-reliant. So they're completely different. You can still be non-self-reliant and spend more.
And we've already seen this play out. The EU recently proposed 150 billion euros in military loans, but with a massive catch. The money should go to European defense manufacturers. And the US reaction? You guessed it, extremely unhappy. Marco Rubio gave Europe a stark warning. Do not exclude US companies from our defense market. Anyway, let's jump back to our timeline. In 2014, President Obama began gently nudging Europe to...
So it seems like to the USA is that Europe isn't an ally. They're a convenient buyer of their military assets, and they're a convenient diplomatic weapon against doing what they want around the world if they get some European countries on their side.
Step up its defense efforts.
Which is pretty depressing.
That pressure didn't stop. It only grew, especially with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that brings us to our fourth lesson. One could argue that the US isn't really that interested in helping Europe become stronger. It's more focused on channeling European money into its very own military-industrial complex. And also, let's not forget, buying US equipment doesn't just mean firepower, it means reliance on American parts, training, logistics, and political goodwill. Now, onto the million-euro question. Why would the US really want a weak Europe? And here's what I think.
Diplomatic reasons, I think, mainly. Just before I hear his opinion here. Diplomatic reasons is that if Europe is weak without the USA, then you always have something to leverage against Europe when you want them to get on your side in your global endeavors. Since we've reached the end of World War II, we've turned away from more colonialism. If you disagree with me here, let me know. I could definitely be wrong. From outright colonialism to more mask behind the scenes diplomatic colonialism. Colonialism, not the great word, but instead of just being bully, like just mask off bully, you are more behind the scenes bully. But as long as you get other, like take the first Gulf War, for example. Although it was, the invasion of Kuwait was a problem for everyone. The USA couldn't just defeat Iraq on its own. It probably could have, but there's a big deal in having other countries on your side for aesthetic reasons, for the way that your fight is presented. Because if it's just you, then you can very much seem as just some bully aggressor that is fighting this weaker country for their own interests. But if you have a bunch of very well-respected and powerful European countries that are reliant on you in some ways, then you can use that as a way to get them on your side in some geopolitical endeavors you have with their backing that'll make you look more legitimate and less like a bully.
A strong, unified, and militarily independent Europe could one day become a global power in its own right. And Washington simply doesn't want partners. It wants followers.
Yeah.
Think about it. What's easier for the US to influence, control, and profit from? A united European bloc, 27 countries with a common foreign policy, a shared defense structure, and maybe one day even a joint army? Or 27 fragmented nations, each spending 5% of their GDP on US-made weapons, but not coordinating with each other? You really don't have to guess where the Trump administration stands on this. Their American first rhetoric makes it pretty obvious. They prefer a divided Europe. And this is likely one of the reasons why Trump and his allies have shown open support.
The problem with that is that so did presidents before Trump. And so how does Trump's rhetoric make him different in his outlook on number 2 here compared to previous presidents who might even be more pro number 2 than even Donald Trump, you know?
Europe. And this is likely one of the reasons why Trump and his allies have shown open support for far-right nationalist parties across the continent, like AfD in Germany, Fidesz in Hungary, or Le Pen's National Rally in France. Because weakening the European Union works in America's favor. A fractured EU is easier to pressure, easier to dominate, and much, much easier to outcompete. Just look at the trade tensions now between the US and the EU. It's a lot easier to pick off individual countries one by one than to take on the European Union as a whole. But let me be clear, this does not mean that Europe should cut ties with the US. Not at all. The transatlantic alliance matters, but that alliance should be based on mutual respect, and Europe should be a partner, not a pawn. Thank you so much for watching.
So great video, and I agree with this final statement right there. I do think what he said here is a bit of a stretch. It could be, because I think he might be overthinking this part.
Reasons why Trump and his allies have shown open support for far-right nationalist parties.
I think that might be a stretch. Not that they support openly far-right nationalist parties, but that the reason, I think saying the reason they support them is to divide Europe. Maybe that's true, but I think, I don't even think, I think it's just because he likes them and likes parties that are not so friendly to the Democrats in the USA. And so, although that he might be right here, I don't think that has to be the case, you know?
Pretty obvious. They prefer a divided Europe. And this is likely...
yeah, so saying that, I think you might be giving Trump a bit too much credit there. I don't think it's that deep. I think he just likes those parties. But he could be right. Great video. Love y'all. Would appreciate any comments down below. Anything I said that you thought was wrong, call me out. Any questions I had, you guys were awesome at answering them. Look forward to seeing the comments. And hopefully I'll see you guys next video. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.